Hey folks, thanks for watching. It is Friday, August 8th, and I thought because it's Friday, let's talk about hurricanes, derechos, and volcanoes. And I think all three are relevant for our forecast. I'm starting with this radar loop here. It is, man, it's impressive. This is another one of these North Dakota potential derecho straight line thunderstorm wind events developed in the evening last night. See, it really started out as almost 3 bow echoes. Oh, it just reset there. Let's let it replay. We saw these kind of 3 thunderstorm complexes develop out of eastern Montana. This one was surging the quickest, but they ended up coalescing into one enormous bow echo that at times had its strongest winds through this corridor here. That moved up near Grand Forks. And man, look at it. This is now this morning. I mean, that is one of the longest, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, stretched out bow echoes. It's obviously weakening as it gets to Minnesota here this morning, but man, that is impressive. I'm going to see if I can sneak my pen in here. So right about here, you can see the apex of the bow, kind of that like widest part of it. It's right there, but then that shifts. See that shift a little bit further to the north, and I'm actually, let me take control of that. So as it comes through south central near Bismarck, the strongest winds, we actually look for where that bow is surging out the fastest, where it's getting out ahead of that whole line. So that's clearly occurring there. But notice closer to this morning, that shifts to the north, that kind of apex of the bow. So you would think our strongest winds would be in here initially overnight and then shifting to the northeast. And if we pull up the storm reports from last night, you can kind of see that's hard to get these in overnight. You see that shift. But I would expect this whole area is going to fill in. Again, the exact definition of a derecho will depend on kind of the SPC. But for all intents and purposes, I mean, that is a massive thunderstorm wind event still ongoing. Even from like a global perspective, like zoom this in. I mean, you have a low pressure system here near Iceland. We have that next wave coming off Africa that we're watching, a tropical storm here. But man, that system, that bow echo over the northern plains, one of the most like impressive global features that we can see now on radar here this morning. And again, similar to the other derechos that we've seen this year, I'm going to pull up this map. And I know you're saying like, Matt, why are you showing me this ridiculous plot on Friday morning? This is a atmospheric sounding, and really what we're looking at, I'm looking at over here. This is going up in height, and we're looking at temperature in red and dew point. You think of this as moisture in green. And as you go up in the atmosphere, both moisture and temperature predictably decrease. We can see that. But if you'll notice here, as we go up in the atmosphere, the dew point isn't decreasing very much, all the way up to like, well over a mile into the atmosphere above our heads. This was from North Dakota last night. So there's just a ton of moisture, and we've seen this all year long, really all the way through the northern plains into the upper Midwest, where we've had deep moisture as a result of that Bermuda high. You can see these southeast winds and these surface observations just pumping that moisture in. And then just above it, right, just I was talking about that like mile above our heads, you'll notice that like right here around 800 millibar, that moisture just craters. It falls off very quickly. And that's because what you have in here is something we call an EML, or an elevated mixed layer. And this is dry air. And so what we've done in North Dakota last night, and what we've done repeatedly this year, Iowa earlier this year, is we put a lot of moisture underneath a lot of drier, cooler air. And you can actually see those temperatures decreasing very quickly with height as well. And as you know, the atmosphere, it doesn't like instability. It doesn't like when things are misaligned. So when it sees a lot of this moisture just beneath this dry air, and then you put wind shear on top of it, we can see that. Look at these westerly wind barbs as we go up in height. Near the surface, they're almost easterly. So at the surface, you have winds coming in like that. Well above, you have winds moving very quickly. There's your wind shear, right? Rapidly changing with height. And you add those 3 ingredients together, and you're going to get big weather every single time, especially, in North Dakota this time of year. So we saw that last night. If we just look at infrared imagery here this morning, I mean, that is the dominant feature. You could argue in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm just genuinely one of the largest, most expansive kind of MCS complexes that I have seen. That bow echo stretching from Manitoba all the way down almost through kind of near Sioux Falls. Extremely impressive. We looked at those storm reports. You'll notice not much activity elsewhere. If we just look at the last 24 hours of precip across the continental U.S., this was from southern Iowa. We actually maybe even talked about this yesterday morning. A few scattering showers and storms underneath that in the mid-south, and then the southeast continues to stay wet. But otherwise, besides that plains and prairie precipitation, not too much to look at on this map right now. I want to show this plot. This is the 500 millibar wind speeds. I've plotted underneath it total precipitable water. So that is, you can think of it as kind of the absolute measure of water vapor in the atmosphere. Now, behind the trough over the northwest that was powering that derecho event last night, we can see all this dry air. That's actually the source of that EML that I showed you on that plot. So that kind of quickly drop off of moisture as you go up into the atmosphere. And that is as important to these storms as anything else. Obviously, another critical piece to that is moisture. So plotting that precipitable water shows us that there's still plenty of moisture today out in front of this trough across Minnesota, Wisconsin. That's prompted the Storm Prediction Center to highlight this area for a slight risk today. Kind of complicating this forecast, frankly, is that there is a big weakening bow echo right through the middle of the risk area. So that's kind of got to get weakened and worked out of the area before storms may fire later on today. You can see this area without thunderstorms expected. These are always kind of telling where the center of the ridge is because you don't get a lot of storm development underneath it. And as a result, you can see this heat advisories expanding all the way from northern Wisconsin out ahead of the system. There's those severe thunderstorm warnings, red flag warnings with that dry air and the high winds behind that trough. Extreme heat warning still over the southwest, so that expansive ridge down here that's kind of peeling its way even further east now, bringing in more heat to the central Corn Belt as the Central Plains deals with some of this triple-digit heat. We just look at temperatures here this morning. I'll make it valid almost near 7 a.m. Central. Quickly warming up those temperatures here in eastern Nebraska and Kansas into the 70s. We're well on our way to triple digits in western Kansas and south central western Nebraska as well. 90s across the board, getting further into the central Corn Belt, maybe high 80s over in the eastern Corn Belts as well. Behind that trough, though, cooler temperatures here. Cooler in the southeast where we've seen plenty of cloud cover and rain. Now, as I go into Saturday, that cold front associated with that trough, these bow echoes that we've been talking about pushing further to the southeast. Some of this heat now more anchoring over New England, over the Great Lakes area. This area was just up here recently this week and saw some pretty dry acreage here that's developed just in the last 3 to 4 weeks. So needing some precipitation here, not these kind of repeated high heat events that we've seen here of late. Unfortunately, if I take this forecast Tuesday, Wednesday of next week, particularly Monday and Tuesday, you can see this New England heat really settling in now into the low to mid 90s. Again, really hoping to get some precipitation into this quarter here. I think it's coming Tuesday to Wednesday of next week, kind of when we see this little cool down. So you see this little trough sneak through here. We'll talk about that in just a second here. I did want to show the simulated radar. This is from the 3-kilometer NAM. If we make it valid about, let's do 7 a.m., there's that weakening bow echo. Again, it's maybe even more expansive than the NAM thought, and I wouldn't blame the NAM for not expecting as much, but if I take this forecast forward, you see that weaken and work out of the area. Expecting additional widespread severe thunderstorm development behind it overnight tonight in Minnesota. Again, more so of a late event. You see storms don't even really get going until 8 to 10 p.m. Perhaps some storms over here in the Central Plains, but all that heat here kind of putting some questions to that forecast. Overnight, the system again works a little bit more toward the southeast, and so that risk area now expanding over to eastern Iowa, southern Wisconsin, maybe pushing through Illinois overnight. See if I can take this forecast a little bit further. So those storms weakening into Missouri and Illinois overnight. Again, this corridor here, trying to get some precipitation here. You know, portions of the Ozarks, Missouri. We've gone over dry in this corridor, even some parts of Illinois, recently re-included into drought classifications as of yesterday. There's that SBC Day 2 outlook, again highlighting that Iowa and Wisconsin risk further to the south, and then potentially that high plains risk, the central high plains over Colorado, Nebraska, western Kansas. If we go pining for that Day 3, maybe further toward the mid-south, again, not quite seeing it as expansive. So as this trough exits to the east, we're losing some of that lift in this area here, but still watching for thunderstorms as we go through that forecast here. If we look at the 500 millibar height forecast, this is from the ECMWF. I want to just find that trough and then follow it through. So making this valid about 7 a.m. Friday. There's that trough. There's that ridge that we were talking about. See ridging over the East Pacific, over the Canadian Maritimes. That tends to result in some sort of central U.S. trough. So we're seeing that in that forecast play out here today on Friday and Saturday. If we take the forecast into tomorrow morning, you can see that trough shifting further east. This ridge expanding across eastern Canada and New England, bringing more heat there into Sunday and Monday. This trough doesn't move very quickly. Right? As we get out into now Monday, still lingering here with both of these ridges here, one expanding over New England, one over the Northeast Pacific. It's just not allowing this trough to quickly skate through. But we do see it trying to move through on Tuesday. There's multiple pieces to this now moving through the Midwest, potentially through Missouri and Illinois. And then again, hoping as this kind of pushes further to the east, we get some precipitation in this corridor here and this corridor here that have gone over dry. There's been this kind of persistent midsection kind of beneath some of these high plains and upper Midwest storm systems and the southeast precipitation. You've it's just like a little midsection area of the country that has gone over pretty dry in recent weeks. If I play this forecast all the way out toward the future, we see a few things occur. One, the ridging that was entrenched here over the Northeast Pacific has started to push further west, perhaps due to some tropical development, some cutoff flows here. but more so just this ridge expanding here over New England and starting to push and retrograde even into the central U.S. So seeing heat in the long range here in this corridor and then pushing and returning back to the central plains. We'll look at that more in detail kind of at the end of this. I do want to look at the precipitation forecast quickly from the ECMWF. We kind of already covered some of these corridors here on Saturday. We are seeing the southeast continue today and tomorrow. Some of this precipitation waning a little bit in intensity, even going into Sunday, seeing this continue across Georgia, South Carolina, even into the Gulf states. By Monday, you can see precipitation here across the Midwest, even through Kansas, Missouri, northern Illinois, Wisconsin, northern Michigan. So we see that trough exit further east. Now we're seeing better precipitation all the way into getting into the Mid-South, finally Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas critically. So you can go over dry here recently. Some of this continuing here as we go through Tuesday into Wednesday. And then finally some of New England, upstate New York, western Pennsylvania, portions of Ohio, Indiana, seeing some precipitation in this forecast even into Thursday for this corridor here. So this is good news given that we're going over warmer for such a long period of time in this area. I was hoping to get some precipitation into that corridor here. I saw it continuing in the southeast, some additional precipitation here over the northern plains through that stretch. Really this kind of area staying dry outside of that. See this from the 7-day forecast from WPC, kind of highlighting an area here near Galena, Illinois, the driftless area of Wisconsin for excess precipitation up toward 5 or 6 inches just over the next 6 to 7 days. The southeast staying wet, and then starting to see some of these forecasts pushing the monsoonal thunderstorm activity further north near the Four Corners. It's not getting like up into here where we'd expect more typical monsoon activity, but it's something, and we're seeing this in the long range as well. I'll point that out in a minute or two. Still seeing some dry areas here. I can pick some out here in New England, but at least in the 7-day getting something here, anywhere from like a ½ inch up toward an inch from New York through Kentucky, Tennessee. Some serious questions about Arkansas, but the ECMWF a little bit more bullish on that precipitation, working its way a little bit further to the southwest. But you can see some corridors in here where we're staying on the drier side. Overall, decent precipitation forecast for a high production region here across mid-August in the middle part of the country. If we jump over and just look at that same plot, but as a 7-day anomaly, again, you can see that stretch from the Canadian Prairie through the middle part of the country, getting up into the Mid-South and the Mid-Atlantic here. Again, some drier areas that are sneaking in to this forecast, even unfortunately Arkansas here, maybe even the central and northern plains, but by and large, a pretty decent precip forecast headed forward through August. That'll be important because just looking at the 10-day temperature anomalies, right, this is what I was stressing earlier from Illinois to New York, Maine, eastern Canada, and this is a warm stretch here through the middle part of the month. Still cooler over the southeast, still generally cooler with all the activity over the northern plains. But as we warm up here, we want to keep that precipitation going, and we see that at least for much of that corridor going in. This takes us from the 8th to the 18th, just in those temperature anomalies. Another way to look at this, just the 6 to 10 day from the Climate Prediction Center, the 13th through the 17th. It's highlighting an area here from the Tug Hill Plateau, Rochester down through Erie, Pennsylvania. This is a dry area right now. Right, we've seen a lack of rainfall there recently, and now we're adding those high degree of confidence above average temperature forecasts. And so that water stress starts to spike here. So we really need to watch for that rain on Tuesday and Wednesday for some of the acreage in this corridor here. I want to do a brief segue. I mentioned hurricanes earlier in this video. We've seen the Eastern Pacific remain a little bit active, even as our focus has shifted to the Atlantic. We have Henriette here. This is a little bit closer to Hawaii, out in what we might call the Central Pacific. And we have Tropical Storm Evo that formed recently just west of Mexico. And in looking at this chart quickly, what's strange about this is when we saw the Pacific really active, all the storms, you see these are, here's our latitudes, so 20 north, 15 north, 10 north. A lot of the storms we saw earlier this year were just above like 10 north and between 10 and 15. And then when they started to get north of that, they weakened. Now, Evo and Henriette are not strong right now, right? Not even hurricanes, especially Henriette, very weak this morning. They're a little bit further north, which is curious, up near 20 north. And we talked about how as they get closer to that line near Hawaii, they tend to weaken. And that's been the case with Henriette. But there is something with respect to Henriette, despite being a very weak storm with very little development right now, that I have never seen before from a tropical storm, at least in this part of the world. And that is its current forecast cone, official from the National Hurricane Center, has it remaining a tropical storm as it pushes over some of these cooler waters here as it goes to the north. But that H, even all the way up here to 30 north, I mean, you're talking like getting up here into like the same latitude as like the southeastern United States. it comes back to an H. That is a hurricane. So it's expected to strengthen as it moves north of Hawaii. Now, mind you, we expect storms to weaken when they approach this kind of, last stretch toward the state and the islands, let alone strengthen even north of them. And so what's happening here is connected with what Eric mentioned at the end of the video yesterday with respect to this record low PDO. And so we've seen these PDO values just crater here in summer of 2025, down to essentially record lows of -4. But we stress that this has been this bizarre trend we've seen of late. In fact, if I just took you to like May of 87 and asked you to draw a trend line of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, I mean, that line's going to look something like that, right? I mean, maybe if you're conservative, maybe more aggressive. And this is the warming up of those ocean temperatures in the central North Pacific. Now, these are anomalies, what we display and look at here. So it's not the absolute temperature. This area is always some of the warmest water we have in the Pacific, along with areas over here. But because this water stayed so warm this summer, here's Henriette's current position in this relatively cooler water off of Cabo stretching toward Hawaii, that as it goes to the northwest, it's expected to strengthen into warm water. So I've never seen that before. It's indicative of a pattern and a trend in the ocean that we frankly haven't seen before either. And it's something we have to account for. Eric talked about this at the end of the video yesterday. We have to think about where we're going with respect to winter. When we're seeing it have an impact, even on these little tropical storms, that's a unique forecast cone, one that I'm going to remember just in case we see some odd precipitation and temperature patterns going through fall and summer. I want to zoom in and look at this a little bit more in depth. This will just be an ongoing thing, so Eric and I will just continue to kind of investigate this. And one thing I found that I took the 0 degree level. So this, you can think of this in the atmosphere as where we have that 0 degree Celsius or 32 degree Fahrenheit line. It's usually in summer well above our heads, but in winter it comes down to the surface, if not below it. And we look at that level all around the globe and see, as that level either rises or falls, that tells us the atmosphere, at least with some respect to the middle part of it, is heating up or cooling down. And so if I just look at that as just kind of a rough measure of heat in the atmosphere, if we look at that level from 2022 to 2024, so kind of the last 2 to 3 years, versus the 10 years prior, so not looking like comparing it to the 80s or the 50s to now, but I just want to compare the last 2 years to the last 10 to 15, and we can see that that level's been warming very quickly. Now, implicated in this is the El Nino event that we had in 23. That always warms the atmosphere because you get more heat expanding out of the Pacific. So I think we're seeing some of that here. But boy, we see these other areas of warming that are very aggressive, not compared to like those 1970 normals or the 1991 or even the 1999, but like to the last decade. And a lot of that warming, the most magnified area of it, is here north of Hawaii, south of Alaska with respect to that increasing PDO. I think what might be implicated here, along with El Nino, is potentially the Tonga eruption. That produced a lot of water vapor. It, frankly, vaporized a lot of water, turning it into water vapor and launched it into the stratosphere. And that has a net warming effect as a contribution. So we haven't seen it as much of a cooling effect, but likely a warming effect playing out here. And Tonga erupted at the beginning of 2022. We saw this initial aggressive warming occur after that. We don't have 2025 in here, but there is some recent data to suggest that at least the magnitude or the contribution of that warming is starting to wane. And so we might see this reverse a bit over the next few weeks if some of those early data and indications are correct. If I just look at sea surface temperature anomalies comparing 2022 to 2024 versus the 10 years prior, again, seeing this warming here in the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, here over in the Eastern Pacific. Again, some of this just El Nino background state from 23. But man, that aggressive warming off the coast of Japan, north of Hawaii, stands out more than anything else in this map. So there's that kind of record low PDO. Is this going to stay around forever? I don't think so. But it is going to play a role certainly in the next few seasons with respect to temperature anomalies, drought risk in the middle part of the country, which I think will be lessened as a result of this. Just jumping over, we showed these, all the time, and I'm going to continue to do so because they're just incredible images of that eruption again in the beginning of 2022. Just a massive global event, but so remote and thankfully few injuries as a result. If you want to see what 50,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools getting evaporated at one time would look like, that's all that water. Just like millions of metric tons being thrown up into the stratosphere here. So an impressive event. There's that image there. You can see this is that water vapor, these clouds getting lofted up into the upper atmosphere that is potentially causing the shift in the PDO. I do want to jump back. This is the National Hurricane Center, their current outlook for the Atlantic. So we do have this weak system unlikely to develop here off the coast of the Carolinas. We've been following this potential development here in the mid-Atlantic. These two, frankly, look like fish storms, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them right now. If I jump over and show you the ECMWF ensemble forecast, this is looking out for those low-pressure systems in various model runs at the end of next week. So I'm actually taking this all the way out to August 16th because I'm not expecting those two storms here to be a big threat to the United States, the current ones in the outlook. We are seeing that wave that I showed way at the beginning of this video sneaking out into the Atlantic. It's moving at a little bit more of a northward trajectory than previously thought. So last time I talked to you, I was showing you maybe something coming in here to the Lesser Antilles next week. That shifted further to the north. That has me less concerned for a mainland U.S. Landfall. But some of these model runs, you can see this cluster here, are hanging around a little bit further south. So we'll have to see as we get through next week if something can sneak through here and develop on kind of the southern side of this model envelope, as we call it. That'll be something we'll have to watch because then it might be able to sneak underneath the Bermuda High and either toward the Bahamas, maybe Florida, the southeast. Again, that's just a possibility at this point, not a home run forecast. It never is. And frankly, the Atlantic has been a little bit hostile, even with some of the recent development of late. I did want to piggyback off of Eric's Bay of Campeche comments yesterday. So he talked about how in some of these long-range models, we kept seeing some signal pop up here in the southwest portions of the Gulf. We call this the Bay of Campeche here near Mexico. I just pulled up, I was curious if it would pop out in the NMME, that is the National Multi-Model Ensemble. This is their precipitation anomaly forecast for September, October, and November. And curiously, you'll see that there's that wet pattern that we talked about from British Columbia all the way through the plains into the Midwest, eastern Canada as well. This drier stretch through the southern half of the country, the Four Corners all the way over to the Carolinas. There's that little wet area here that we have to keep an eye on for some homegrown development. 2017, Harvey kind of came up through a similar area, caused tremendous flooding issues in southeast Texas. So any storm that develops there has flooding potential for Mexico, Texas, Louisiana. We see that kind of similar forecast. This is from the IRI. This is their forecast in July. We'll get an update from this maybe in about 15 days. But you could argue they have a little bit painting an area here as well. To keep an eye on. They keep these forecasts over land, but you could kind of extrapolate some precipitation anomalies in the positive direction here, and then that southern half of the country forecasting weather. Curiously, a little bit drier for British Columbia, less of a signal there, but I can still kind of see that same pattern that we're watching here for this fall. I did mention Harvey. Again, that made landfall in Texas in 2017. And if I jump over, I looked just curiously at their August date, so that would be same year or same date as today, to look at those sea surface temperature anomalies. And I was surprised to see how similar they look just at a glance. So we see a few things. If I compare this to now, I'll jump over and show you August 6th, 2025. Now, obviously, we just talked about this. The North Pacific looks much different now because of the recent changes, maybe due to the eruption playing some role there. But do you see this Atlantic Nina that we talked about? There's this kind of remaining Pacific Nina, and I jump back and show you 17. There's that Atlantic Nina, and there's that weak Pacific Nina. So those two line up. The heat content in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Caribbean, warm in both models. Still have some warmth. Sometimes we think warmth here can have a negative effect on some hurricane development if it's relative to colder area here. We're seeing maybe a little of that from both models as well, not too much, but in general, some similarities here between the two. We don't see this kind of negative PMM signature this year in 2025, but found that interesting just because 17 had that Harvey landfall. And then curiously, their autumn, September, October, November, drier southern half of the country, and they had that same kind of focus on the Northwest. We could use this here in the Northwest this year, given some of the drought that's built in here, and then the precipitation coming in like that. So keep an eye on that analog just in the back of my head between the two, both for the hurricane season and then fall. The 2017 hurricane season was very active, and 17 named storms, so 3 above average, but it included Maria, devastating impacts to Puerto Rico, included Irma, which kind of scraped along the greater Antilles before coming up, causing issues in Florida, and then obviously Harvey, as I mentioned. I did kind of skip over this earlier, so I wanted to double back and show you the long-range forecast. This is the ECMWF AIFS I've taken it out. Let's do Saturday. We talked about Saturday, August 16th, when we might have some storm to watch coming over here into the Atlantic. When I do take the forecast that far out, we still see this ridge kind of dominating over the Great Lakes, stretching through portions of the southern plains. We see a trough here over the Pacific Northwest, ridging over the Northeast Atlantic, really more than just the North Pacific, I should say, south of Alaska. Now, that's kind of what we discussed at the beginning of this forecast, the Maritime Canadian Ridge, a ridge over the Northeast Pacific. But as the forecast went out, we saw that ridge retrograde over the Pacific, and that allowed some troughing to build in further to the west, and allowed more ridging to finally get into the middle part of the country. And as I take the forecast out, we do see that play out in the 18th, 19th, and 20th. But the models have been doing this all summer long, kind of pulling this ridge back to the four corners, and we haven't seen it play out exactly like this. So can I buy this now? I don't know. I do think we'll have heat expand from New England toward the middle part of the country, but is it going to become kind of this dominant front range ridge as we get out toward the 20, 21, 22nd of the month? I don't know right now. I have to be skeptical when we see these ensembles pull back like this. We just haven't seen it as much this year. If I jump over and let's just compare this to the ECMWF ENS itself, and we'll take this forecast well out. And it has that same ridge retrograde in the Pacific, and allows this ridge to develop back over the four corners again near August 20th. It's there in the models. I do think we'll see some heat expand as we get through the middle part of the month. I don't know if it's going to be this big anchoring ridge that just dominates right near the end of the month. You can see this a little bit from the Climate Prediction Center, the 15th through the 21st. There's that New England, Eastern Midwest, Eastern Corn Belt ridge trying to kind of push back into the Central Plains, the Northern Plains at least briefly. If we look at the 8 to 14 day temperature outlook, we'll take this, let's do 10 to 15 days. We can see some of this from the GFS, with that heat expanding more so over the front range, but you'll notice the ECMWF ENS not quite as aggressive in those 10 to 15 day temperatures in the middle part of the country here, keeping it more off toward the northeast. If we look at the 8 to 14 day anomalies, the ECMWF Ensemble and AFS kind of have a wetter corridor through the Canadian Prairie into the upper Midwest. The ECMWF Ensemble a little bit more widespread with that. But the GFS Ensemble is going over drier here in that 8 to 14 day corridor. So even a more expansive ridge trying to build in kind of near the 20th to the 22nd for this area here. We'll have to watch that disagreement here. Again, leaning toward the ECMWF solution with not quite as strong of a ridge, and then better precipitation chances through this corridor here. Eric mentioned maybe even pushing in through here, we could see some activity like we're seeing even this week. So we'll keep an eye on that as we get to it. That's kind of our next fork in the road in the 8 to 14 day forecast. Climate Prediction Center kind of leaning more toward that ECMWF solution, that precipitation staying above average in those contours in the northern plains. And they're not even going with a wide dry area here over the midsection here. So I think that's good news as well in terms of just those precipitation chances that we'll see to watch as some of this heat builds back in. I'll leave it there today. Thanks for watching as you get through this weekend. Eric will be back with you all on Monday.